The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like a swarm of insects trapped in plastic, and Brooke Sullivan moved through the pediatric ICU of Seattle General with the kind of invisibility that came from 17 years of making other people's emergencies look easy. Her scrubs were the same shade of blue as everyone else's, intentionally forgettable, and the trauma shears clipped to her pocket bore no markings, no unit insignia, nothing that whispered of the life she'd been ordered to forget. The ventilator in room for 12 wheezed its mechanical rhythm as she passed, a sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat, and she checked the foredrip on a sleeping 7-year-old without breaking stride, her hand steady as a surgical laser, the kind of hands that had sutured wounds in places the Pentagon would rather pretend didn't exist. Seattle General's pediatric ward smelled of antiseptic and something underneath it, the faint copper tang of fear that parents carried in through those sliding doors. Brooke could read it on their faces before they even got to the admitting desk. She'd learned to recognize that specific flavor of desperation in Tikrit, in a forward operating base 3 kilometers from the Syria border, in a blackened room where the definition of triage had nothing to do with insurance coverage. But that was before. That was the life she'd had erased with a single classified briefing and a new social security number. 3 a.m. shift. The unit was quieter now, just the hiss and beep of machines that never actually slept, and Brooke made her rounds with the kind of methodical precision that came from muscle memory so old it predated her civilian paperwork by a decade. She checked monitors, adjusted medication drips, pressed a hand against the forehead of a feverish 5-year-old to assess skin temperature before the digital readout confirmed what her touch already knew. The charge nurse, Michelle, had left her a note about incoming admissions, a trauma case from the interstate. Drunk driver, T-bone collision at 67 miles per hour. Family of 4. 1 pediatric patient en route. When Marcus Chen arrived, it was for 18 in the morning, and his father was carrying him like he weighed nothing at all, which meant his legs probably didn't work anymore. Brooke could read the anatomical story in the way Staff Sergeant David Chen held his son, the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his eyes tracked every monitor as the attending physician rattled off preliminary findings. 8 years old. Spinal cord trauma at T12. Loss of motor function below the injury site. CT imaging confirmed significant cord compression with what the radiologist had called severe disruption of normal architecture. In layman's terms, it meant the spine was broken and most of the doctors in this building had already stopped looking at the imaging and started planning which kind of wheelchair would fit through the doorways of the Chen family home. Dr. Pierce arrived at 6:19 a.m. with his entourage of residents trailing behind like pilot fish behind a shark. He was tall, that kind of tall that made people in hospitals unconsciously defer to him, and he wore his title the way other men wore watches, expensive, visible, and impossible to ignore. His hands, when Brooke saw them reviewing the CT scans, were uncalloused and perfectly manicured, the hands of someone who hadn't touched a patient in years, if he ever had at all. He spent 12 minutes reviewing the films with the residents, pointing at areas of cord signal change, using phrases like irreversible pathology and no realistic functional recovery, and he said all of it with the kind of certainty that made fathers stop hoping. The damage is done, Pierce told David Chen, his voice modulated with what probably passed for compassion in hospital corridors. We'll manage pain, work on comfort measures, connect you with rehabilitation specialists. But paralysis from the injury site downward is permanent. He'll need 24-hour care, potentially for life. He placed a hand on David's shoulder, the gesture of a man performing compassion, and then he left, his white coat moving like he was walking through water that only he could feel. Brooke read the chart notes an hour later, when the ward was cycling toward morning shift change and she had 17 minutes before she was supposed to clock out. She wasn't supposed to read the notes, wasn't supposed to do anything except administer medications and change dressings and make sure nobody died before the day's shift arrived to take credit for keeping them alive. But something in the billing codes caught her attention. 3 specialist consultations billed at $2,847 each, neurosurgery, orthopedic trauma, and something labeled spinal cord regeneration consultation, which was interesting because there was no spinal cord regeneration specialist listed anywhere in Marcus's actual chart notes, and the signature on that particular consult was so illegible it might as well have been a machine-generated placeholder. She pulled the imaging herself, logged into the hospital's PACS system with her credentials, the same credentials that said RN and nothing else, the kind of invisibility that came from not having rank, and she looked at the CT and MRI films with the eyes that had watched a Navy SEAL medic named Jackson die in a forward surgical tent because the nearest trauma surgeon was 70 kilometers away and the helicopter couldn't fly through the sandstorm that summer. The spinal cord compression was real. The trauma was extensive. But the way Pierce had written his notes made it sound like Marcus Chen was a corpse that hadn't stopped breathing yet, and the billing codes didn't match any services that had actually been documented. The folded flag from Jackson was in her locker, wrapped in a plastic bag underneath her street clothes, 13 stars folded into a triangle that she wasn't supposed to have, that no one in her civilian life was supposed to know existed. She'd held that flag every night for 17 years, and she knew the weight of things that nobody was supposed to carry. She knew what it looked like when someone gave up on a patient who might have had a different future, if anyone had bothered to look hard enough. Brooke pulled up the hospital's billing database, not something she was supposed to access, but the password had been left on a sticky note next to someone's computer in 2019 and nobody had ever changed it, and she began looking at Dr. Pierce's other pediatric cases, scrolling through the specialist consultation codes, the phantom billable hours, the consultant fees that never quite corresponded to the doctors who claimed they'd rendered those services. 12 cases in the last 18 months. Roughly $34,000 in questionable billings per case. Pierce was signing off on these consultations, and somewhere in that machinery, someone was taking a cut. She should have stopped there. She should have clocked out and driven home to her apartment that held nothing personal, no photographs, no proof that she'd ever been anyone besides the woman who showed up at 7 p.m. every third night and kept children alive while their parents tried to understand what it meant to lose a son but keep him breathing. Instead, she printed the billing audit, made a list of the inconsistencies, and by the time Dr. Pierce arrived for his morning rounds at 8:13, she was waiting in his office, that list of discrepancies on the corner of his desk, her eyes flat and cold as winter sea. "There are some billing codes here that don't match any documentation in the chart," she said. Her voice was quiet, that particular quiet that came from 17 years of not drawing attention to herself. The regeneration consultation. I couldn't find a note from that specialist. No dictation, no signature. Just the billing code. Pierce looked at her like she was something he'd stepped in. He looked at her like she was a nurse, which meant nothing, which meant less than nothing, asking questions about things that weren't her job to question. And in that moment, something shifted in his face, a tightening that lasted maybe 1 second before his expression smoothed back into something professional. He'd understood, in that single moment, that she'd noticed something he'd preferred to stay invisible. "That's not your concern, Ms. Sullivan," he said, and his voice had changed, had become something with edges. "Billing is handled by administration. Nurses administer care." "Of course," she said, and she stood and turned and walked out of his office, leaving the printed audit on his desk like it was nothing, like she'd never seen his hand shake slightly as he reached for it, like she hadn't watched the calculation happen behind his eyes. What did she know? Who had she told? What would it take to make sure she didn't become a problem? She didn't know that she'd already become the kind of problem that made men like Pierce nervous enough to act. She didn't know that in exactly 92 hours, everything she'd tried to keep buried was going to come screaming back to the surface. All she knew, as she clocked out and walked into the pale Savannah morning, was that somewhere in this hospital, a little boy who should have had a future was being written off so that a surgeon could hide billing fraud behind medical terminology and the kind of certainty that came from knowing that no one ever questioned doctors. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that 17 years ago, in a blackened room in Tikrit, she'd been the surgeon who was supposed to make those kinds of impossible calls, and she'd been very, very good at saving people that everyone else had already decided to let die. The hospital corridors at Seattle General were designed for efficiency, not mercy. Brooke moved through them like water through a grid, present but unremarkable, exactly the way she'd been trained. Her scrubs were the right shade of blue. Her badge hung at the prescribed angle. Nothing about her posture suggested that 17 years ago she'd held a man's spinal cord in her hands while bullets punched through the walls around her. Grand round started at 6:44 a.m. on a Tuesday, which meant the attending physicians would gather in conference room C with their residents in tow, coffee cooling in styrofoam cups, charts spread across the polished table like battle maps. Dr. Pierce arrived first, as always. His shoes clicked against the tile with the precision of a metronome, a man who understood that sounds could communicate authority just as powerfully as words. He wore a $6,400 watch. Brooke had noticed it the way soldiers notice weapons. Not with admiration. With assessment. The residents filed in like ducklings following their mother. Two of them exchanged glances when Pierce entered, the kind of look that said they'd already learned to be careful around him. The third one, a young woman named Chen with intelligent dark eyes, simply opened her tablet and waited. She was the only one who sometimes asked questions that weren't designed to flatter. Pierce spread Marcus Chen's chart across the mahogany table. Not the official chart. The annotated version. Brooke watched from her position near the door. She'd learned long ago that corners and doorways were the best places to observe without being observed. Pierce's fingers traced the margin notes, the one she'd written 3 days ago about the inconsistencies in his billing justifications. What we have here, Pierce said, his voice pitched to carry but not shout, is a cautionary tale about scope of practice. He held up the pages like exhibit evidence. Our ICU nurse, Ms. Sullivan, has decided that she possesses the clinical judgment of a neurosurgeon. Look at these annotations. Expensive consultation. Specialist fees questionable. Request review of charges. He shook his head slowly, inviting the residents to join him in the performance. This is what happens when clinical support staff exceed their lane. They start seeing conspiracies. They start questioning judgment calls made by physicians with 23 years of experience. The room shifted. Brooke saw it happen in real time, the way the resident's spine straightened, the way they angled themselves slightly away from her position, as if association with her views might be contagious. Chen kept her eyes on her tablet, but her jaw tightened. That small movement meant something. Brooke filed it away. When a nurse begins contradicting attending physicians in front of families, Pierce continued, we have a liability concern. When a nurse starts suggesting that established medical practice might be fraudulent, he let that word hang in the air like a blade, we have a different kind of problem entirely. The attending physician next to him, Dr. Holloway, shifted his weight. Holloway was decent. He'd trained in trauma, knew the difference between protocol and politics. He didn't speak, though. That was the architecture of institutional power. Silence was complicity, and complicity was how you kept your position. Pierce set the chart down with deliberate precision. Ms. Sullivan means well. That's never the question. The question is whether we can afford to have support staff second-guessing our clinical decisions based on incomplete information and nursing school training. He smiled. Just barely. Just enough to let everyone know he'd made a joke. Let's move to the next patient. Brooke turned and walked back to the 7th floor without changing her expression. Her hands were steady. Her breathing unchanged. The room went silent for 3 seconds after she left, the kind of silence that meant people were processing whether they'd just witnessed something they should be ashamed of, or something that needed to happen. She found the vending machine on the 7th floor at 7:13 a.m., exactly when her break rotation allowed. She needed coffee that tasted like something other than hospital recycled air. The machine hummed its electric song as she fed in $2 bills. The coffee dropped with a mechanical thud into the paper cup below. Ms. Sullivan. Pierce had followed her. Not casually. Deliberately. His footsteps had been quiet, but not quiet enough. He'd wanted her to know he was there. I wanted to speak with you about what you heard in conference room. She pulled the coffee from the slot. The cup burned her palm. She didn't react to that either. Your notes on the Chen case, he said, moving closer, they suggest you believe I'm overcharging families. That's a serious accusation. His voice was conversational, the way a shark might make small talk before feeding. I'm wondering if perhaps your background, community college nursing program, I assume he might not have equipped you to understand the nuances of billing for specialized consultations. Community college. He looked up her file. Fabricated credentials that went back 17 years, every detail architected by people whose names she'd never learned and couldn't ask about. The cover story was airtight. A girl from Portland, nursing degree from a 2-year program, unremarkable work history, no military service. No family to contact. No record of anything before 2007. I performed a field thoracotomy once, Brooke said quietly. The coffee cup sat in her hands, steam rising from it like a question. On someone who didn't have time for specialists. Didn't have time for consultations or paperwork or billing codes. He was bleeding out at 2 liters per minute, and the nearest trauma center was 47 minutes away. She paused. The knife was the surgical instrument available. Pierce's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes flickered. Recognition, maybe. Or fear. The inability to categorize her. That's remarkably graphic, he said. And not relevant to this conversation. Isn't it? She turned to face him fully, and there was the moment he recognized that something about her posture had fundamentally shifted. She was standing differently now, weight distributed like a boxer between her feet. Her shoulders had dropped half an inch. Her eyes were level with his, and they were the eyes of someone who had made peace with consequences. I've triaged men with more spine than you'll ever have, doctor. The ones who talk the most. She let the silence extend for 2 full seconds. They always bled out first. She turned and walked away before he could respond. Didn't wait for his denial or his bluster. Didn't need to see his face redden or watch him reach for the next weapon. Her job was finished. She'd said what needed saying. The rest was his to carry. Behind her, Pierce stood motionless in front of the vending machine, coffee cup in hand, realizing that he'd just been threatened by someone in scrubs with 19 years of actual surgical experience, and that no one else would ever believe him if he said so. The calculation happened in his mind with visible precision. She was a threat. Not because she could report him, she had no proof that would survive legal scrutiny, and his institutional position was armored with decades of reputation and alumni connections. She was a threat because she'd seen the machine he'd built, understood exactly how it operated, and wouldn't be quietly broken by public humiliation. That required a different approach. That required strategy. He walked back to his office at 7:22 a.m. and made 3 phone calls. The first was to the hospital board president. The second was to his contact in human resources. The third was to the private security company that managed after-hours access. Each conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Each one planted a seed that would need 3 days to grow into the justification for termination. She didn't know it yet. She was already moving past knowing. By the time she understood that he'd decided she had to disappear, he would have already started the machinery that made it legal. Brooke sat in Mel's diner at 3:06 a.m., the kind of place where the coffee never got fresh and the waitress never asked why you were there alone staring at your reflection in the window. Outside, rain hammered the glass like it was trying to get in, or maybe trying to convince her that the outside world was as hostile as every classified briefing had promised. She held the folded flag in her lap, the one she'd kept since Tikrit, the one she'd never told anyone about. White and black and the precise geometric folds of Arlington ritual, pressed into her hands by someone whose name she could no longer say aloud. Jackson. 17 years ago, when Pentagon operatives came to extract her from the field hospital after the operation went sideways and the Black Ops mission got buried 6 layers deep, Jackson had already been flag-draped in a metal box. The promotion she never got credit for, the commendation she couldn't accept, the career she'd had to abandon, all of it had been traded for this, a folded rectangle of fabric and a new social security number and orders to vanish into American civilian life like she'd never existed. The coffee got cold. She didn't drink it. She tried to remember what it felt like to be someone people could see. To have a rank that meant something outside locked rooms. To say her real name without checking first to make sure no one was listening. 17 years. That was long enough for the memory to become theoretical. She could describe the feeling the way someone might describe a color they'd seen once in a painting but never in nature. The rain kept falling. Her reflection kept staring back, and the woman in the glass didn't look like Brooke Sullivan anymore. She looked like someone who'd traded everything for survival, and wasn't sure the trade had been worth it. Wasn't sure if staying alive meant anything when no one alive knew who she actually was. 3 miles away, Pierce sat in his study and crafted the first of several emails documenting her concerning behavior patterns that would be timed to arrive in HR systems at 5:51 a.m., when nobody would notice the timestamps were backdated. By tomorrow afternoon, there would be a formal meeting. By next week, there would be termination papers. He didn't understand that he'd just started the countdown to his own ending, that he'd made the exact mistake every antagonist makes when they escalate against someone with nothing left to lose. The rain kept falling on Seattle. The flag stayed folded in her hands. And somewhere in the darkness, the machinery he'd set in motion was grinding toward a collision that would require a general salute to resolve. The monitor showed 97% oxygen saturation at 2:14 a.m. when Marcus Chen's breathing changed. Not the gradual decline of deterioration. The sudden shift. The kind that stops time. His small chest heaved against the ventilator settings. Once. Twice. Then his lips darkened from coral pink to something closer to slate. His left eye twitched. The heart monitor accelerated, one steady beat becoming a rhythm that climbed like a siren nobody else seemed to hear yet. Brooke was 3 feet away, checking the foresight on his right arm. She saw his color shift first. Not the monitor. Not the alarms that hadn't fired yet because the equipment was still calibrating what her eyes already knew. Tension pneumothorax didn't announce itself politely. It came like an ambush. Air trapped in the pleural space. Pressure building. Lung collapsing. She didn't call for Dr. Pierce. She didn't reach for the intercom. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory older than the scrubs she wore, and she was already moving toward the supply station where the decompression needle lived in a sterile case alongside chest tube trays and equipment she'd used to assemble in forward operating bases that didn't exist on any official map. Down the corridor, through 2 sets of double doors, Pierce was on his phone with the hospital administrator. She could hear his voice from the ICU entrance, smooth as oil, explaining something about liability protocols and staffing redundancies. His calculated reorganization had split the night shift so that coverage gaps made her presence irrelevant. 6 nurses covering what should have been 9 positions. He'd been specific about it. Strategic. Brooke didn't wait. She never waited. The needle, 14-gauge angiocath, felt familiar in her grip. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The anatomy was identical whether the patient was a Navy SEAL with a sucking chest wound in Tikrit or an 8-year-old boy in a hospital room in Savannah. Marcus's ribs were narrower. His skin still carried the softness of childhood. But the physics of air under pressure remained absolute. I need you to hold his left arm steady. Her voice had dropped an octave. Not a question. Not a request. The night nurse, Rodriguez, 3 years out of nursing school, froze for exactly 1 second, then moved. She didn't ask who Brooke was or why she was taking command. Some people recognized authority the moment it entered a room, regardless of where the badges were supposed to be worn. Marcus's eyes went wide. Small and terrified. The oxygen mask fogged with his panic. Hey! Brooke made contact with his gaze. Held it. I know this is scary. I need you to be very still for me. 10 seconds. Can you do 10 seconds? He nodded. His lips trembled. The needle went in at the correct angle, perpendicular to his ribs. She felt the resistance of skin, then the immediate release, that specific hiss of air escaping under pressure. Oxygen saturation began climbing immediately. 71. 78. 84. 89. 92. Stable. Color returned to his lips like someone turning up a dimmer switch. The heaving chest relaxed. His eye stopped twitching. The entire procedure took 90 seconds. Pierce appeared in the doorway at second 91, his phone still pressed to his ear, his expression cycling through confusion into something darker. Something that looked like a man watching the ground shift beneath him. "What did you do?" His voice wasn't loud. It was worse than loud. It was the controlled fury of someone whose careful architecture had just collapsed. Brooke didn't answer. She was already disposing of the needle in the sharps container, checking Marcus's oxygen saturation on the monitor, confirming that his breathing had synchronized back to the ventilator. 95%. Steady. The boy's color had returned to normal. His small hand reached out and gripped Brooke's wrist. "Tension pneumothorax." She said it to the room, not to Pierce. Left-sided collapse. Needle decompression at the second intercostal space. O2 sat recovery confirms the diagnosis. "You don't have authorization to." Pierce stepped into the room. The patient's oxygen saturation was 71 and dropping. Brooke turned to face him. Her eyes were flat and empty, the color of winter water. "You were on the phone." "I made a clinical decision." "Clinical decision?" He said it like she'd slapped him. "You performed an invasive procedure without physician order." "You performed it on my patient without." "Your patient?" Brooke's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "His name is Marcus Chen. He's 8 years old. He has a 70% chance of walking again if his treatment protocol accounts for the pneumothorax that just nearly killed him while you were discussing administrative procedures." Pierce's jaw tightened. His hands clenched. But he didn't explode. That would have been easy. Instead, he did something more dangerous. He smiled. A smile like a door closing. "I'm calling administration. Now." He pulled his phone back to his ear and stepped into the hallway. "Yes, I'm still here. We have a situation. A critical situation. Ms. Sullivan has just exceeded her scope of practice in a manner that constitutes both a safety violation and potential liability. I need security posted to this ICU wing. Effective immediately, Ms. Sullivan is restricted from patient contact pending a formal review." Rodriguez's eyes went wide. She looked at Brooke, confusion and concern mixing in her expression. Brooke didn't move. She checked Marcus's for sight again. Adjusted the ventilator settings slightly. Entered notes in his chart with the precision of someone documenting a procedure for a court of law. Every movement exact. Every notation detailed. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. Marcus watched her face. The terror in his small features had shifted to something else. Something almost like recognition. "You saved my life," he whispered. "You held very still," Brooke said. "That's what saved your life." Within an hour, Pierce had reassigned Rodriguez to the trauma bay on the other side of the hospital. He'd called the chief nursing officer and fabricated a disciplinary memo citing dangerous nurse overreach and physician impersonation. He'd somehow arranged for security to station themselves outside Marcus's room, ostensibly for the boy's protection, but with clear instructions that Brooke Sullivan was not to have unsupervised access to any of her previous patients pending investigation. She was still in the building. Still on the payroll. But she was effectively suspended, cordoned off, removed from the equation he'd been carefully constructing. What Pierce didn't understand was that Brooke had already survived erasure once. Being locked out of a hospital room was a small thing compared to being erased from every database the Pentagon controlled. She was cleaning out her locker at 3:11 a.m. when the fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in surgical white, when the building felt like it belonged only to ghosts and machines. The folded flag from Jackson sat in the bottom, beneath her spare scrubs and the personal items that didn't constitute a life. 13 stars. The burial flag from the one person who died on her watch in Tikrit. The one piece of proof that Captain Brooke Sullivan had existed. She held it in both hands and stared at nothing. The phone call came at 11:02 p.m. Brooke was still in the break room, staring at a cold cup of coffee, when Pierce's voice crackled over the hospital intercom requesting an immediate staffing adjustment. By midnight, the night shift had been reorganized completely. The two experienced nurses who usually covered the pediatric wing were pulled to trauma. The charge nurse who supervised Brooke's assignments was reassigned to administration for urgent credentialing review. In their place came floaters, competent enough, but unfamiliar with the unit's rhythms, with Marcus's specific needs, with the subtle signs that a child's condition was deteriorating. The schedule gaps were surgical. Deliberate. A 4-hour stretch where coverage overlapped just enough to look legitimate but sparse enough to isolate Brooke. She recognized the tactic instantly. She'd seen it used in Tikrit when command wanted to separate a problem asset without making it obvious. Cut the support structure. Create plausible deniability. Let the target fail alone. At 1:22 a.m., Pierce made his second move. The board president's voice came through on the hospital administrator's phone. Brooke heard it echo through the administrative corridor as she walked past. Pierce had called the home phone. Mobilized the institutional machinery. He'd built his case carefully: emotional compromise following a critical patient intervention, scope violations that bordered on dangerous, a pattern of questioning physician orders that suggested instability rather than diligence. His voice, she knew, would have been smooth as silk. Concerned. Almost sympathetic. The language of someone protecting the hospital from liability, not someone protecting himself from exposure. By 2:38 a.m., the restriction notice was official. Brooke stood in Marcus's doorway as Security Officer Williams, a decent man with 3 kids of his own, handed her the document. His face was apologetic. The hospital policy was clear. Pending formal investigation into her conduct during the emergency resuscitation, Ms. Sullivan was restricted from direct patient contact. All access to Marcus Chen's room required administrative approval. It wasn't suspension, not yet. Just precautionary. Just until they could sort things out. "I'm sorry," Williams said quietly. Brooke didn't respond. She folded the paper once. Twice. Pocketed it. She looked past him into the room where Marcus slept, his small chest rising and falling, the monitors beside him showing the heart rhythm she'd fought to restore just hours earlier. The boy's father sat in the corner chair, head tilted back, asleep. Neither of them would see her again. Not here. Not like this. Pierce emerged from the nurse's station as Brooke turned to leave. She didn't acknowledge him, but she felt his eyes tracking her movement with the satisfaction of a hunter watching prey back into a corner. He'd done it cleanly. No confrontation. No dramatic firing. Just bureaucratic suffocation. It was smarter than his vending machine performance. Quieter. More final. She cleared her locker at 3:06 a.m. The photograph of her SEAL team, faces and names carefully blurred in case anyone looked too closely, came down first. The trauma shears with her call sign etched into the handle went into her jacket pocket. The scrubs she'd worn through 3 tours worth of civilian emergencies got folded into a gym bag. Everything that mattered fit into something the size of a showbox. Everything that didn't matter stayed behind. At the bottom of the locker, under the spare shoes, her hands found it. The flag. Jackson's flag. The folded triangle of red, white, and blue from a service that the Pentagon said never happened. 3 stars, carefully counted. She held it against her chest for 17 seconds, not long enough for anyone passing to call it an emotional moment, but long enough to feel the weight of it. Proof. Evidence. The only thing tying Captain Sullivan to Brooke the nurse with the damaged personnel file. She could throw it away. Leave it in the trash. Walk out of Seattle General as if the person who'd carried that flag had never existed. The rain started at 3:51 a.m. Not Seattle rain, soft, polite, a drizzle that announced itself quietly. This was the kind that hammered. Rain that sounded like applause against the parking garage concrete, like judgment, like the sound of everything collapsing at once. Brooke sat on the bench outside the emergency entrance, her gym bag at her feet, watching the water stream off the hospital awning and pool on the asphalt. Her scrubs were already soaked. She hadn't grabbed a jacket. The folded flag sat on her lap. Maybe they were right, she said aloud. The parking lot was empty. No one heard. Maybe this is all I ever was. A problem they needed to contain. The rain hammered harder. She thought about the apartment she'd rented under the name Brooke Sullivan, 16 months of payments, a lease with 7 months remaining, a life held together by paperwork and the willingness of a landlord not to ask questions. She thought about Marcus Chen waking up at dawn, wondering where the nurse had gone. She thought about her bank account, $847 left, not enough for first, last, and deposit on somewhere new. Not enough to vanish again. Soldiers don't cry. The words were automatic, embedded in her like shrapnel. Soldiers don't break. Soldiers don't sit in rain at 4:13 a.m. holding a dead man's flag and wonder if it was worth it. She lifted the flag, held it at arm's length over the concrete. The rain plastered it against her hand. One motion. That's all it would take. Drop it. Watch it float down the drain. Become nothing. Erase the last piece of proof that she'd ever been anything except what they told people she was. Her hand shook. Not from cold. Not from crying. From the kind of trembling that lives under the skin of people who've held discipline so tight for so long that letting even a fraction of it slip feels like shattering. Jackson's voice came back, suddenly vivid as if he were standing there in the rain. Not the him that died in Tikrit. The him from 3 years before, sitting in the barracks at Camp Lezon, talking about the kid he was going to have. A daughter. He was going to name her something that meant hope. He never got to meet her. The flag they gave her mother had 13 stars. Pentagon couldn't even get that right. Brooke pulled the flag back. Folded it tighter against her chest. At 4:22 a.m., she heard it. Distant at first. A sound that took her breath in a way nothing had for months. A rhythmic pulse cutting through the rain. Not an ambulance. Not a fire truck. The distinctive percussion of helicopter rotors, muffled by weather and distance but unmistakable to anyone who'd ever fast-roped from a bird under fire. The rotors grew louder. Closer. Multiple birds, she thought. At least 2. Coming in fast. She stood. The gym bag fell from her lap into the rain. The folded flag remained in her hands. She had no idea what was about to happen next. But for the first time in 16 months, Brooke Sullivan felt something crack open inside her that looked almost like hope. 3 a.m. at Seattle General had a particular silence, the kind that came from knowing most people were asleep and nobody was watching. Brooke moved through the pediatric ICU corridors with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned to occupy space without being seen. The security guard at the nurse's station was scrolling his phone, his eyes glazed. She had disabled his room access alert system hours earlier by exploiting a loophole in the restricted access protocols that Pierce had ordered installed. It took 3 minutes, a badge swipe from a maintenance tech she'd befriended, and a basic understanding that security systems were designed by people who had never actually fought for their lives. Marcus Chen's room was dark except for the monitor glow casting blue shadows across his small frame. The ventilator had been removed 3 days ago. His breathing was his own now, steady and quiet, the sound of a child who was finally healing. Brooke entered without knocking, closing the door behind her with the gentleness of someone who knew the weight of doors. The boy's eyes opened. They focused. They found her. His small hand reached across the hospital bed toward the empty chair, and when his fingers found hers, he whispered the word that changed everything. Dad says you're Phantom. The room held its breath. David Chen's head whipped around from the window where he had been standing vigil, the folded flag with 13 stars still clutched against his chest like a weapon. His jaw dropped. For 5 full seconds he didn't breathe, then his voice emerged rough and fractured. Captain Sullivan. They told us you were KIA in Tikrit. Brooke didn't respond. She stood perfectly still, her hand in Marcus's, feeling the weight of 16 months collapse into a single moment. The boy's father was holding the proof of a life that no longer existed on paper, staring at a ghost, his eyes moving across her face as if searching for the woman he had left behind in 2008. David pulled his phone from his pocket with trembling hands. "There's a record. Pentagon keeps it. Classified file." He pulled up a document, the letters glowing white on the screen. "Silver Star." His voice shook reading the citation aloud. "Captain Brooke Sullivan, extraordinary Valor under fire. Saved 12 lives while critically wounded. Remained in combat despite," the words carried into the hallway, into the fluorescent-lit corridor where a 2-star general in dress blues had stepped out of his daughter's room to stretch his legs. The general heard extraordinary Valor. He heard saved 12 lives. He heard the citation number and stopped. His posture changed. Something shifted in the way military men stand when they recognize rank that has been stripped and hidden. He walked toward Marcus's room with the deliberate pace of someone who had spent 40 years learning how to read situations, stepped inside, and executed a salute so crisp it sounded like a whip crack in the quiet. Hospital administration arrived 45 seconds later. Pierce was behind them, his face flushed, his voice already escalating. "That's enough. Ms. Sullivan, you falsified your credentials on your employment application. You listed a bachelor's degree you don't." "She has a doctorate in combat medicine from Walter Reed," David interrupted, still holding the classification document. "Awarded 2009. You don't have clearance to see it." The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator down the hall wheeze out its mechanical breath. Pierce's jaw clenched. He opened his mouth to respond when the elevator doors at the far end of the corridor slid open and 2 figures in dark suits stepped out, their movements carrying the unmistakable efficiency of federal agents. The woman had her badge already visible, the leather credential case flipping open before she was halfway down the hallway. Her partner was holding an arrest warrant in his other hand, the paper precise and official. "Dr. Richard Pierce." The agent's voice carried no inflection. It wasn't a question. Pierce's face drained of color. Actual color, the way a person looks when they understand the next 30 seconds will determine the rest of their life. He stepped backward. "I don't know what this is about, but if you're here about Ms. Sullivan, I can explain that she..." "You can explain it to the Bureau." The female agent held out handcuffs. Not the plastic zip ties used for quick transport. Real metal handcuffs, the kind that meant booking and photographs and a cell. "You're under arrest for altering official federal documents. That would be your attempt to remove Captain Sullivan's legitimate credentials from her personnel file at 11:53 p.m. on November 14. Problem is, when you touched her classified status file, every alarm on the Pentagon network went off simultaneously." Pierce's hands came up. "I was just doing my job." She was practicing outside her scope. She performed a needle decompression without physician authorization. She was authorized by Combat Medical Code 7A, which supersedes civilian medical hierarchy during life-threatening emergencies involving trained military personnel. The male agent opened a tablet, the screen bright with documents. "Your audit revealed 18 months of phantom billing. Specialist consultations that never happened. Insurance claims for procedures that weren't ordered. Kickback arrangements with medical supply vendors totaling $467,000. The handcuffs clicked closed around Pierce's wrists with a sound that echoed in the hallway. He started talking then, the words spilling out in desperation. Those claims were standard practice. Every hospital does it. Every physician has vendor arrangements. You can't arrest me for that. You have no authority. I'll sue. His voice cracked on the last word, and he turned to look at Brooke with eyes that had finally understood what he had been standing next to for months. Not a timid nurse questioning billing codes. Not a woman who could be intimidated into silence. A Navy SEAL officer who had been trained to kill with her bare hands and had instead chosen to hold a child's hand through paralysis and recovery. You have the right to remain silent. The female agent began reciting his Miranda rights as they walked him toward the elevator, his designer shoes clicking against the tile floor with each step. Behind them, 3 nurses emerged from the station, their faces showing absolutely nothing. The kind of nothing that came from watching someone finally receive what they deserved, and knowing they could never say it aloud. The general excused himself and returned to his daughter's room. David Chen held the phone tighter, the classification document still glowing on the screen like a confession. Marcus's hand had not let go of Brooke's. Within the hour, the board president called. Within 2 hours, Brooke's personnel file was corrected and her restricted access revoked. Within 6 hours, the hospital announced a new protocol for medical billing and a mandatory third-party audit of all vendor arrangements going back 5 years. Seattle General would establish a veteran services wing funded by the hospital's general revenue, with Brooke as its de facto director, though they offered her the title of Chief of Trauma Medicine if she wanted it. She didn't. She asked for scrubs instead. 2 months later, Marcus Chen walked out of Seattle General without assistance, his paralysis reversed through spinal decompression and the specialized rehabilitation protocols that Brooke had fought to implement. His father stood beside him, not holding him up, just holding his hand the way people do when they know they nearly lost something irreplaceable. Across the city, in a municipal parking lot on the edge of Savannah's commercial district, Dr. Richard Pierce was assigned to a medical supply van as his court-ordered community service. He drove it to clinics and health centers, unloading boxes of bandages and 4 kits, his hands performing labor instead of surgery. The name tag on his uniform read Richard. The other staff members who had worked under him pretended not to recognize him when he delivered supplies to their facilities. The way they looked past him, through him, the professional courtesy extended to no one, that was its own kind of punishment. Brooke returned to the pediatric ICU the following Monday morning. She was there at 6 a.m., moving through the hallway in her scrubs, checking vitals on patients who no longer whispered when she entered rooms. One of the other nurses, a young woman named Sarah who had watched the entire situation unfold, asked her during shift change if she wanted to grab coffee. They sat in the break room, and Sarah asked her straight out, "Were you really a Navy SEAL?" Brooke stirred her coffee with deliberate slowness. "I was a trauma medic. Saw things most people don't see and hope they never have to." She paused. "And I'm just a nurse now, which means I get to choose who I help instead of being ordered to. That's a better choice." Sarah understood that for what it was, not a deflection, but the truth. Some wars don't end on a battlefield. They end in quiet hallways with monitors beeping and small hands reaching for someone they trust. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The ability to stand next to the man who tried to destroy you, to hear his words, to feel your hands flex into fists, and then to choose not to break him, because breaking people was what your training had taught you, and healing them was what you had chosen instead. That was the real bravery. That was the part that never made it into citations or medal ceremonies or classified files. So here's the question for you: if you discovered someone at your workplace was stealing from patients, would you stay quiet to protect your career? Or would you be willing to risk everything you'd spent years building to stop them? Drop your answer in the comments below, and subscribe for more stories of quiet warriors who refuse to look away. Because the people who change systems aren't always the ones shouting. Sometimes they're the ones pushing a medical supply van through the rain, finally understanding the price of their own silence.